In medieval Europe, a wedding did not end with vows or a kiss. It ended in a bedroom, crowded, hot, and noisy. The newlyweds, pale with exhaustion or fear, would be led there by friends, priests, servants, and sometimes strangers who had been drinking since dawn. The laughter was not always kind. This was not a moment of romance, but of duty and spectacle. Because until the couple had physically joined, the marriage was not considered real. Love was private, but law was public, and in this world, law came first. The bedding ceremony, as it was called, was equal parts carnival and courtroom. In noble households, it began with the guests marching through the halls carrying torches and shouting jokes that grew increasingly obscene. They sang about what was about to happen. They teased, mocked, and congratulated all at once. The bride and groom were paraded like trophies, stripped of their dignity before they were stripped of their clothes. The bed itself was a stage carefully arranged for the ritual. Sheets of fine linen, sometimes embroidered with family crests, waited under the gaze of those who believed they were defending the honor of both families by witnessing what came next. The priest's role was to bless the bed, not the act, but the space. He would sprinkle holy water over the mattress, muttering prayers that mixed purity with possession. Then he would step back, handing the scene over to the audience. Servants would remove the couple's wedding garments, a process performed with the giddy cruelty of tradition. The guests would clap, whistle, or offer crude advice. Sometimes the bride's mother or the groom's closest friend would tuck them in, ensuring that they lay beneath the same cover. Then at last, the curtains were drawn. But the audience didn't always leave. In certain courts, France, Scotland, parts of Germany, witnesses were required to remain in the room until the couple's union was confirmed by sound or sight. Nobles, bishops, or even the king himself might wait just beyond the bedpost, straining to hear proof that the marriage had been sealed. To modern ears, it sounds like madness, a ritualized humiliation disguised as duty. Yet in the medieval mind, this was not intrusion, it was protection, a guarantee that no one could later challenge the legitimacy of an heir. Marriage was property, inheritance, and politics wrapped in lace and linen. The body was evidence, and evidence had to be witnessed. The couple's privacy was never their own. It belonged to the bloodlines that had arranged the match. Especially among royalty, the pressure was crushing. When Margaret of France wed Edward III of England in 1299, she was 20. He was 60. The bedding ceremony took place before the full court, and chroniclers wrote that the king was led with great cheer unto his bed. What they meant, beneath the polite Latin, was that everyone waited for the sound that proved the old king still had life enough to produce another heir. For peasants, the custom was simpler, but no less public. In village weddings, the newlyweds might be escorted to a cottage, amid drunken cheering and pounding on the walls. The neighbors gathered outside, singing songs so filthy they could not be written down. They were called charivari, bawdy serenades that mocked the awkwardness of the wedding night. Sometimes the crowd didn't stop until the groom emerged, red-faced, holding up the bride's garter or some other token to prove the deed was done. This ritual of collective voyeurism served a strange purpose. It turned personal intimacy into social order. By witnessing the moment, the community felt it had participated in the creation of a new household. The laughter, the teasing, even the cruelty, all acted as glue, binding the couple not just to each other but to the village that surrounded them. The body was not private, it was civic, but the ceremony also carried danger. If, for any reason, consummation failed, if the groom was too drunk, too old, too frightened, the consequences could be devastating. Annulments, lawsuits, and humiliation followed. In some courts, physicians were called in to examine the groom, poking and prodding to determine whether he was capable of performing his marital office. If he wasn't, the marriage could be declared void, and the bride returned to her family, her reputation bruised beyond repair. The bed, once blessed, could become a courtroom again, and the witnesses, its judges. One chronicled case from 17th century France tells of a nobleman, aged and impotent, whose young wife accused him of failing to consummate their union. To prove her claim, a public inspection was ordered. Doctors, midwives, and priests gathered in the chamber as the man was made to expose himself, trembling and pale. Their verdict was recorded in ink, and his humiliation preserved forever in parchment. The law that once demanded witnesses now demanded proof. The line between intimacy and evidence had vanished entirely, and yet, for all its cruelty, this obsession with the witnessed bed was not confined to Europe. In Japan's Heian era, noble weddings required the groom to visit his bride for several nights in secret before being publicly acknowledged. But even there, a final act of witnessing took place, servants quietly confirming that the union was complete. In certain parts of Africa and the Middle East, similar customs developed independently. Sheets displayed, families gathered, the same collision between love and law. Across continents, humanity seemed united by a single anxiety, that without proof, there could be no trust. What's haunting is how these ceremonies blurred the line between consent and obligation. For many brides, especially in arranged marriages, the first night was not just their wedding night, it was their introduction to fear. Surrounded by laughter they did not share, commanded into bed by voices they couldn't defy, their first moments as wives began not with tenderness, but with performance. The bed was no longer a symbol of rest or passion, it was a stage set for survival. In some regions, this performance was refined into elaborate etiquette. The couple was to speak no words during consummation, a rule meant to preserve reverence. Some texts even advised the bride to remain silent and still, as though virtue could be measured in motionless obedience. The groom, meanwhile, was instructed to pray afterward, repenting the act even as he fulfilled it. In this twisted theology, marriage was not the beginning of joy, it was the beginning of duty. Over time, the practice began to shift. The Protestant Reformation challenged many of these customs, arguing that the sanctity of marriage lay in mutual consent, not public proof. By the 17th century, in much of northern Europe, bedding ceremonies became symbolic. Guests might accompany the couple to their chamber, but leave before the curtains closed. What had once been real became theatre, a reenactment of a fading tradition. The laughter remained, but the eyes no longer watched. Still, the shadow of the old ritual lingered. Even today, echoes of it survive in traditions we barely notice. The crowd that stays to see the couple's first kiss, the teasing toasts at the reception, the friends who decorate the honeymoon suite. These gestures, stripped of cruelty, carry the same ancient idea: that marriage is not entirely private, that community has a claim on the moment two lives join. The line between witness and intrusion may have blurred, but it has never vanished. The audience in the bedroom has disappeared, but the memory of it remains in the architecture of our customs. The white sheets, the wedding toast, the phrase, "tying the knot," all remnants of a time when love was public business and the bed a courtroom. What was once spectacle is now story. And if you listen closely in every just married celebration, you can still hear the distant echo of a crowd outside a wooden door, laughing, singing, waiting to be sure that history and lineage have begun again. The medieval world was ruled not just by kings, but by calendars. Every passion, every hunger, every touch between man and woman was measured against a holy clock that rarely allowed for freedom. The Church, with its long memory and longer list of prohibitions, turned intimacy into arithmetic. It wasn't that desire was forbidden, it was that it had to be managed, confessed, and performed on schedule. The bed might have been a private place, but the rules that governed it were written in Latin, copied by monks and enforced from pulpits across Christendom. For centuries, the Church's stance on sex was shaped by fear. Fear that the body could lead the soul astray, that pleasure was a whisper from the devil, that procreation was the only acceptable outcome of physical union. Priests preached that even within marriage, lust was a sin if it was enjoyed too much. Passion belonged to the fall of man, not to paradise. So they drew lines, hundreds of them across the calendar, until couples were left with barely a handful of permissible days in which to act on their vows. Sundays were forbidden. So were Wednesdays and Fridays. Lent, Advent, and nearly every feast day of a saint demanded abstinence. If one added up all the prohibitions, nearly half the year was off limits. The Church declared that to engage in sex during those periods was to invite sin upon the household. The Virgin Mary, saints and martyrs were to be honored with denial, not indulgence. Even the timing of conception was judged. Certain nights were thought to yield weak or cursed offspring, others strong and holy ones. In effect, marriage became a lifelong test of restraint, an endurance trial in which pleasure itself was suspect. But the scrutiny didn't stop at the calendar. The act itself was regulated, dissected, and categorized with the precision of a theologian's quill. There was one correct position, the missionary. Anything else was unnatural, a deviation from divine order. Manuals written for confessors described in alarming detail what counted as mortal sin. If the husband sought pleasure before the wife, sin. If the wife enjoyed it too much, sin. If the couple used touch or imagination to heighten desire, grave sin. The body became a battlefield of guilt. Each confession was a negotiation between honesty and fear, a weighing of impulses against eternal damnation. One 13th century text, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, classified lust as a deadly sin that distorted the soul's vision of God. To enjoy sex, even in wedlock, was considered a lesser form of corruption. Aquinas described the body as the animal part of man and warned that giving in to its cravings risked pulling the divine mind down to the level of beasts. Priests echoed this warning in their sermons, turning bedrooms into quiet chambers of anxiety. Every caress became a question. Was this act for love or for sin? The Church's control extended into the confessional booth. Husbands and wives, shamed and trembling, would confess the most intimate details of their marriage to priests, who in turn recorded and categorized them for moral guidance. Questions were not vague. They were surgical. Did you touch your spouse before marriage? Did you use unnatural motions? Did you think of another while performing the act? These interrogations, performed in the dim light of chapels, reduced love to a checklist of forbidden gestures. What was meant to be an act of connection became an exercise in surveillance. The irony was that these same priests were often more informed about the mechanics of sin than the purity they preached. The manuals they used, such as the penitentials of the early Middle Ages, described forbidden acts so explicitly that they read like scandal in disguise. Each offense had a prescribed penance, days of fasting, prayers, or even temporary separation. In a world where literacy was rare, these books became the moral law of Europe, copied by hand and whispered from one monastery to another. The Church's obsession with purity turned the human body into both symbol and threat. Women were especially burdened. Their virtue was measured not only by chastity before marriage, but by obedience within it. Wives were told to submit without joy, to lie still, to close their eyes, to think of the Virgin Mary if their husbands were too rough. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century text, infamous for its witch trials, warned that women's carnal appetites were gateways to witchcraft, that pleasure made them vulnerable to the devil's touch. The simple act of wanting could condemn them. In some places, theologians went so far as to suggest that demons could tempt couples through dreams, stealing their purity without their consent. These incubi and succubi were said to feed on lustful energy, evidence of how deeply fear had seeped into even the quietest corners of married life. For believers, guilt was constant. To resist desire entirely was impossible, and to yield to it was perilous. The Church had created an emotional labyrinth with no true escape. This suffocating moral code also shaped politics. Kings sought papal approval for their marriages, and annulments became weapons of diplomacy. Henry VIII's break with Rome centuries later was born from these same doctrines. His desperation to remarry, to produce a legitimate heir, clashing with the Church's refusal to bless another union. The grip of holy law reached even into royal bedrooms, and yet the system persisted because it offered control disguised as salvation. The Church promised forgiveness, but only after confession. It condemned the flesh, but monopolized absolution. Every kiss that became a sin meant another coin in the offering plate, another soul bound to the ritual of repentance. The machinery of guilt was efficient, self-sustaining, and profitable, but not everyone obeyed. In the quiet corners of rural Europe, folk traditions rebelled. Herbal remedies, fertility charms, and whispered blessings continued alongside the Church's decrees. Couples would visit local wise women who offered more human advice: when to conceive, how to stir desire, how to balance pleasure with prayer. These practices, dismissed as superstition by the clergy, were the remnants of an older world where the body was not the enemy. Some of those women would later be branded witches for daring to teach joy where the Church demanded shame. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to appear in the wall of doctrine. Scholars started to argue that love within marriage could itself be holy. The concept of courtly love, born from troubadour poetry and noble fantasy, began to soften the moral rigidity. Couples were praised for affection, for devotion, for tenderness that transcended mere duty. Yet even this was bound in contradiction. Love was celebrated in verse, but still policed in life. The Church watched it all, unwilling to loosen its grip. The holy calendars that once governed passion would slowly fade over the centuries, their rules eroded by science, reason, and quiet rebellion. But the echo of those prohibitions remains. The inherited guilt, the sense that desire must be justified, still lingers in language and culture. The very idea that love must answer to something higher, God, society, morality, traces its roots to these medieval decrees. To live under such laws was to exist in tension, a world that sanctified marriage but feared its consummation. Each caress risked the soul. Each act of love was shadowed by sin. The Church may have blessed the union, but it claimed the flesh as its own, turning the most human instinct into confession. And in that confessional darkness, the whisper of desire became the Church's greatest tool, not because it could be destroyed, but because it could be controlled. In the medieval world, a girl's childhood could end with the scratch of a quill. One signature, written not by her but for her, could bind her life to a stranger's decades before she understood what marriage meant. Alliances were drawn up in ink long before the bride could write her own name. The young daughters of kings and nobles were the coins of diplomacy, traded across borders to secure peace, land, or power. The idea of innocence, so celebrated in poetry, became a kind of currency. And purity, far from being a virtue for its own sake, was a political resource, valuable only until it was spent. The Church set the legal minimum, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. But those numbers were flexible in practice. Betrothals could be made in infancy, and consummation could be postponed or not, depending on political urgency. For royal families, marriage was strategy. A 12-year-old girl could become a duchess, a queen, or a widow before her voice had settled into adulthood. Her body carried borders and treaties. Her name might unite kingdoms or trigger wars. In a world that treated lineage as legacy, her youth was not protected, it was exploited. Margaret Beaufort is perhaps the most haunting example. Born into one of England's most ambitious families, she was married at 12 to Edmund Tudor, a man nearly twice her age. At 13, she gave birth to the child who would become Henry VII. She nearly died in the process, a small frame, never built for childbirth. She lived the rest of her life in near constant illness, her body permanently damaged by a duty she had no power to refuse. Yet history remembers her as the mother of a king, not as the girl who was broken to create him. Isabella of Valois was 6 when she was married to Richard II of England, a man of 29. Chroniclers describe the wedding as a spectacle of beauty and diplomacy. Banners, music, gifts from 2 nations. What they didn't describe was the child, bewildered beneath her crown, holding hands with a man old enough to be her father. The marriage was not consummated immediately. Richard promised to wait until she was older, but the waiting itself was political theatre. When he was overthrown and killed, Isabella was 12. Her second marriage was arranged soon after. Childhood was an interlude between contracts. These were not isolated cases, they were the structure of power. In noble courts across Europe, daughters were chess pieces, their futures decided in rooms they would never enter. Families debated their dowries like merchants haggling over goods. A girl's worth rose with her beauty, her birthright, her connections, and fell with each passing year. Virgins were priceless, widows were bargains. Every marriage was a transaction that traded a woman's autonomy for her family's security. The ceremonies themselves reflected this cold arithmetic. The bride was often veiled not for modesty, but for anonymity. Her silence was interpreted as consent. When she was too young to speak, a guardian would answer for her. Priests recorded these marriages without question. After all, the Church's concern was legitimacy, not emotion. The law recognized the union as binding if the couple exchanged vows and, eventually, consummated the marriage. The gap between ceremony and act was merely a matter of time and convenience. In such unions, affection was accidental at best. Love, if it appeared, was an afterthought, a fragile rebellion against the machinery of politics. For most, the wedding night was not a beginning, but an obligation deferred. A husband might wait years before claiming his young wife, or he might not wait at all. The Church's rules on age were written on parchment, but power was exercised in flesh. A nobleman could justify anything as divine order. A child bride's silence became submission, her confusion mistaken for consent. For those born into wealth, there was no escape. For those born into poverty, there was often no choice. Child marriage wasn't limited to royal courts. In rural Europe, peasant families married off daughters early to ease the burden of feeding them. A girl of 13 could be sent to a neighboring village to wed a man she'd never met, often a widower twice her age. Marriage, in its purest form, was meant to sanctify love. In its most common form, it was economic survival. Even queens were not immune to its cruelty. Catherine de' Medici, married at 14 to Henry of France, arrived in a court that despised her for her lineage. Her youth was seen not as innocence, but as inexperience, a weakness to exploit. Her failures to conceive were blamed on her, not her husband. The same pattern repeated across dynasties. Young wives judged, discarded, or quietly replaced if they did not produce heirs fast enough. The mythology of purity made this system seem holy. Virginity was treated as proof of virtue, as if a body untouched by desire was somehow closer to God. But that illusion served power. It gave fathers and husbands moral justification to claim ownership over the female body while pretending to protect it. To keep a daughter pure meant to keep her profitable. To preserve her chastity meant to preserve her exchange value. In portraits and chronicles, these girls were praised for their modesty, their obedience, their grace. What went unsaid was that these were survival skills learned young. The medical understanding of the time only deepened their suffering. Doctors, influenced by ancient Greek theories, believed that women matured faster than men, that they were physically ready for childbirth by their early teens. They thought a girl's womb needed to be awakened by intercourse and pregnancy to function properly. What they were really describing was trauma mistaken for biology. The pain of childbirth in children was not seen as horror, it was seen as fulfillment of divine order. In royal courts, the documentation of these unions was meticulous. Chroniclers wrote of wedding feasts, of golden dresses and dowries measured in kingdoms. Yet behind the pageantry, the human reality was grim. A bride who failed to produce a male heir risked annulment or exile. A husband who died left her vulnerable to remarriage, often before she had mourned or understood loss. Some became pawns again, passed from one alliance to another like property. Their lives were reduced to a sequence of negotiations. There were rare exceptions, women who found power within the system that trapped them. Eleanor of Aquitaine, married first to the King of France and then to the King of England, wielded political influence few men could rival. Yet even she was imprisoned by her own husband for supporting her sons in rebellion. Her strength was legendary, but her freedom was conditional. For every Eleanor who bent the rules, there were hundreds of anonymous girls who broke beneath them. By the Renaissance, humanist thinkers began to question these customs. Writers like Christine de Pizan argued that women deserved education and choice, that intelligence was not confined to gender. But progress was slow. The laws of inheritance, the weight of religion, and the inertia of tradition kept the machinery turning. A girl could be a bride before she was a woman, and a widow before she was a bride. What makes these stories so haunting is not just their cruelty, but their normalcy. To their contemporaries, these marriages were not atrocities. They were routine, even celebrated. Portraits of child brides still hang in museums, their painted faces serene beneath jeweled crowns. Look closely and you can see it. The composure of someone taught very young that resistance was useless. The phrase, "till death do us part," took on a darker meaning in their world. Death was often the first mercy that freed them from the contract signed in their names. History remembers their marriages as alliances, but rarely as losses. Their names fill genealogies, not diaries. Their stories survive only as echoes in the margins of treaties and chronicles, a list of unions that built empires and destroyed the people within them. They were queens on paper, children in life. Their crowns were lighter than air, and their choices non-existent. And though centuries have passed, the shadow of those arranged unions lingers quietly in our language, given away, taken in marriage. The father's blessing. Phrases that sound tender but trace back to ownership, to deals struck in candlelit rooms where innocence had a price and purity was just another word for control. It always began with noise. A wedding feast might stretch late into the night, cups clinking, firelight dancing against rough stone, the air thick with sweat, wine, and the smell of roasted meat. Guests were laughing, shouting, singing songs that grew louder with every refill. Somewhere in the hall, the young bride sat stiffly, eyes down, her new husband trying to smile as the music changed tempo. That was the signal. The laughter would shift into chanting, rhythmic and crude, as the crowd rose from the benches to begin what came next, the bedding parade. To a medieval guest, this was not a violation, it was tradition, one as old as marriage itself. The union wasn't truly official until it had been witnessed in some way, and everyone in that smoky hall believed they had a right to see it begin. The bride and groom were lifted, half carried, half dragged, from their seats as the crowd followed, torches bobbing through narrow corridors. The teasing began at once, jokes about fertility, lust, and airs shouted by cousins and priests alike. The more respectable the family, the louder the laughter. The procession snaked through the halls to the bedchamber, which had been carefully prepared. The mattress was new, the sheets freshly washed and scented with herbs. Flowers might be scattered across the bed, symbols of purity and renewal. In noble households, musicians followed to play until the couple was tucked in. And always there was wine, one last cup, spiced with cinnamon, shared between the bride and groom before the curtain was drawn. But the curtain was only for show. The witnesses were never far. Some lingered just beyond the doorway, pretending to joke, pretending not to listen. In royal or aristocratic weddings, a few chosen guests might even remain in the room, waiting for proof that the marriage had been consummated. In theory, this was about legitimacy, ensuring the future heir was beyond dispute. In practice, it was humiliation wrapped in ceremony. The guests took pleasure in pretending it was all in good fun. They made bawdy remarks, tossed pieces of clothing into the crowd, and sang verses that grew filthier as the night went on. In France, the ritual was called la mise au lit, the putting to bed. In England, it was simply bedding the couple. No one thought of privacy. It was as if the community itself needed to confirm that two families had merged, and laughter was their way of masking how invasive it truly was. For the newlyweds, it was less like a celebration and more like a performance. The bride, often exhausted and frightened, was expected to play her role with grace, to blush, smile, and submit. The groom was expected to show confidence, even bravado. Failure could mean ridicule, rumors, or worse. If the groom faltered, whispers spread before dawn. If the bride resisted, her virtue was questioned. The ritual offered no space for fear, tenderness, or choice. In the courts of France and Scotland, records survive describing these nights in unsettling detail. At the marriage of Margaret Tudor to James IV of Scotland in 1503, the English ambassador wrote that the Queen was conveyed to her bed with great mirth. It sounded cheerful on paper, but the word mirth concealed discomfort. She was 14. The ambassadors and noblemen who escorted her were twice her age. They toasted the king's good fortune, blessed the bed, and only then withdrew, leaving behind a young girl and a stranger in a room full of expectation. The ritual's origins lay in practicality. In an age before written marriage certificates, consummation was proof of a binding union. Without it, the contract could be annulled. A husband or wife could later claim the marriage was never made, in body, and the church would listen. The bedding ceremony eliminated doubt, but at a terrible cost. It turned something deeply private into a form of evidence. The bed became a courtroom, and the act itself a legal transaction. For commoners, the same ritual existed in simpler form. In village weddings, there were no courtiers or priests, only friends and neighbors. After the feast, the community would follow the couple to their home, banging pots and shouting jokes. The groom might carry his new wife over the threshold, not as a romantic gesture, but as a ritual of ownership, proof that he had claimed her. The neighbors waited outside, singing or pounding on the walls until the sounds from within told them what they came to hear. Some didn't even wait. They broke into the cottage to pour ale on the couple's feet, a symbolic blessing that felt more like intrusion. By morning, the gossip began. The village measured the night's success not by affection, but by proof. Clean sheets raised suspicion, stained ones were displayed with pride. This was a world that craved certainty, where lineage meant survival, and purity could be proven by a few drops of blood. The bedding parade made that certainty visible, turning life's most private act into public entertainment. But the cruelty was quietest in its normality. For those who lived it, this was not scandal, it was custom. Parents encouraged it, priests blessed it, communities celebrated it. The bride's silence was seen as modesty, the groom's discomfort as humor. The collective laughter disguised the truth. It was fear that kept the tradition alive, fear of scandal, fear of illegitimacy, fear of sin. Occasionally there were moments of kindness. Some accounts mention attendants who gently distracted the crowd, closing the curtains, shielding the bride from sight. In certain regions, symbolic gestures replaced the act itself. The couple might lie side by side while witnesses prayed, leaving the consummation for later. But such mercy was rare. More often, the ritual blurred the line between duty and violation, making spectacle of submission. There were also times when the ceremony served politics directly. In France, the bedding of royal couples was often attended by courtiers who took notes. They reported to ambassadors that the union was complete, confirming alliances between nations. In one infamous case, the bedding of Anne of Brittany and Charles VIII in 1491 was staged as public proof of the end of her independence and the annexation of her duchy into France. The bed was no longer just a symbol of fertility, it was the throne itself. As Europe modernized, the ritual began to change. The laughter remained, but the witnesses slowly disappeared. By the 17th century, the bedding ceremony had become largely symbolic, a playful mockery of old custom. Guests still followed the couple to the chamber, but they left before the door was shut. The songs were gentler, the teasing tamer. It was no longer proof of consummation, only a farewell gesture from the community. The intimacy that followed finally belonged to the couple alone. Still, traces of the old ritual linger even now. The way guests stay to watch a couple's first dance, the laughter when someone shouts for a kiss, the phrase, "carrying the bride over the threshold." All are echoes of the same medieval idea, that marriage is not entirely private, that a community must bear witness to its beginning. The ceremony may have softened, but the instinct remains. It's easy to laugh at the past, to imagine how absurd it must have been to march a couple to bed under torchlight. But the impulse to turn love into performance never fully vanished. Today, it's not the local village peering through the window. It's cameras, social media, the endless expectation that intimacy must be shared, that happiness must be proven. The medieval bedding ceremony was brutal in its honesty. It told the truth about power, possession, and fear. We've hidden it beneath layers of etiquette and decorum, but the story it tells is still ours. The laughter, the mockery, the blessing, the silence, all of it was part of the same strange equation: how to turn two human beings into one legal fact. And in that flickering candlelight, surrounded by voices that would not leave, the newlyweds became actors in a play written centuries before they were born. By dawn, the laughter had faded, the torches had burned low, and what was left was silence, the kind that followed expectation. In the grey light of morning, the room still smelled of wine, wax, and smoke. The wedding feast was over, but the real performance was about to begin. In noble households across medieval Europe, marriage was not complete until there was proof. Not the priest's blessing, not the vows. Proof meant blood. The ritual was called la preuve du lit, the proof of the bed. And for centuries, it was the cruelest moment in a bride's life. The bedclothes, still rumpled from the night before, were examined for stains of red. That blood was supposed to be a sacred sign, evidence that the bride had entered the marriage untouched and that the act had been consummated. A clean sheet, by contrast, could destroy reputations, annul alliances, and send a young woman back to her family in disgrace. The most private act became public evidence, and the most intimate sign of trust was turned into a legal document written in blood. For noble families, this ritual was not optional. A virgin bride was a matter of honor, and honor was currency. Dynasties were built on purity, not passion. A man's power depended on knowing his heirs were truly his, and the only way to guarantee that was through ritualized humiliation. The proof of virginity was displayed to witnesses, maids, attendants, sometimes even relatives, who would gather at the chamber door, whispering, waiting. Once the sheets were brought out, they were inspected like relics of faith. If they were marked, there would be applause, laughter, and congratulations. If not, the celebration turned to suspicion. The logic behind it was as crude as it was cruel. Medieval medicine, built on superstition and fragments of Roman texts, taught that a woman's body always bled during her first sexual experience. The hymen was imagined as a kind of seal, a physical barrier that broke only once. To the people of that time, this seemed like divine design, a built-in test of chastity. What they didn't know was that the human body rarely follows such simple rules. Some women bleed, many do not. Some bleed days later, others never at all. But biology didn't matter. The myth of the hymen became law. The stakes were highest among royalty. In the courts of France, Spain, and England, clean sheets could unravel treaties. Families could lose titles, lands, and dowries. Whispers spread faster than truth. A bride whose sheets showed no proof might be accused of deception, witchcraft, or even adultery. Sometimes her husband would demand an examination, a public, invasive inspection by midwives or nuns. There were no words for consent in that world. The woman's body was an object of inquiry, her silence taken as confession, and so desperate measures became common. Brides, fearing ruin, learned to stage the evidence. Some pricked their fingers before entering the bedchamber, smearing small drops of blood onto the linen. Others carried hidden vials, filled with pig's blood, pigeon's blood, or menstrual cloth. There are accounts from 14th century France of maids assisting in this ritual deception, slipping prepared sheets under the bed or replacing them after dawn. The line between survival and deceit was thin, and both were dangerous. If discovered, the punishment was severe, exile, annulment, or worse. For the women who failed the test, the consequences could be lifelong. A bride accused of impurity was not simply shamed, she was branded. Songs would be written about her failure. Servants would whisper her name as a warning. Even her children, if she ever had them, would inherit her disgrace. In one recorded case from Provence, a nobleman returned his new wife to her father's estate the morning after their wedding, announcing that the proof had not been found. The family pleaded, doctors were called, tests were performed, and still she was cast out. Her name vanished from the family records, as if she had never existed. But the cruelty of the test wasn't just in the moment. It was in the idea that purity was proof of worth. The Church, already obsessed with sexual control, reinforced it. Priests preached that a woman's untouched state was her closest imitation of the Virgin Mary. Purity was not just physical, it was moral, spiritual, even economic. To be clean was to be holy. To be otherwise was to invite damnation. And yet these same men of God demanded the evidence of what they called sin, blood on a bed, to prove holiness. The contradiction was never questioned. Among peasants, the ritual was rougher, but no less cruel. In small villages where gossip travelled faster than truth, the morning after the wedding often became a public spectacle. The groom might emerge with the stained sheet and hang it from a window, or carry it through the village square as proof of his wife's virtue. The crowd would cheer, toss flowers, shout blessings. But if the sheet was clean, there was only silence. Sometimes drunken guests would sing mocking songs, or elders would mutter that the gods had cursed the union. The bride's family might even return part of her dowry to avoid further shame. Even when love existed, the ritual poisoned it. The husband, taught to equate blood with honor, might begin his marriage suspicious. The wife, forced to prove her innocence, began hers in fear. Trust could not grow in the shadow of a test designed to humiliate both. Many couples simply learned to pretend, to play their parts, to keep the secret between them. A few compassionate men destroyed the sheets before dawn, claiming satisfaction no matter the truth. But mercy was rare, and the memory of that first morning lingered long after. By the Renaissance, skepticism began to creep in. Physicians quietly admitted that bleeding was not universal. Some humanist writers mocked the obsession with proof, comparing it to pagan superstition. But the idea of virginity as virtue proved hard to kill. Even as the physical test faded, its moral echo remained. A woman's value was still measured by her chastity, and the stain of impurity, once literal, now symbolic, continued to mark her life. The irony is that the ritual, for all its cruelty, revealed something fragile at its core, a society terrified of uncertainty. The test of the sheets was not about sex, but about control, over inheritance, over bloodlines, over truth itself. In a world built on reputation, a single drop of blood could uphold an empire, and the absence of it could bring one down. Some of those blood-stained sheets were kept for years, folded and hidden in chests as proof of virtue. Others were paraded through courtyards like trophies. None were clean, not because they bore blood, but because they bore the weight of a lie so deeply woven into the fabric of society that even now, centuries later, it stains the way history remembers its women. And when we speak of purity, even today, we're still echoing that old superstition, the belief that worth can be proven, that innocence has evidence, that love, to be trusted, must bleed. It began, as so many medieval horrors did, with doubt, a clean sheet, a whisper, a father's frown, a husband's silence. Somewhere between superstition and law, the question of a woman's purity became a public matter, one that summoned not compassion, but witnesses. When rumors spread that a bride was not intact, the church and crown alike stepped in. Priests, surgeons, and midwives were called to verify the truth of her body. What followed was a spectacle of cruelty masquerading as justice, where anatomy was treated as evidence and shame was mistaken for science. To the medieval mind, purity was not just moral, it was physical, a measurable quality that could be examined, diagnosed, and proven. The female body was a riddle men claimed the right to solve. Clerics wrote about it in treatises, doctors theorized about it in Latin, and midwives were forced to enforce those theories on the living. Their tools were their hands, their eyes, and centuries of error. If a husband accused his wife of deception, if a family's honor was questioned, These experts were summoned to conduct an inspection. They called it an exam virginitatis, a virginity test. The scene was ritualized humiliation. The accused woman, often young, frightened, and already condemned by gossip, would be examined in the presence of clergy or male officials. The priest would pray, the surgeon would prod, and the midwife, usually a woman of experience but bound by social obedience, would pronounce judgment. They searched for what they called the sign of closure, the mythical membrane that was believed to break only through intercourse. If it appeared open, she was branded impure. If it seemed sealed, she was declared innocent. The verdict could determine everything: her dowry, her safety, her freedom. What made this cruelty worse was that it was fueled by the authority of science, or what passed for it. Medieval medicine drew heavily from Galen and Aristotle, whose ancient ideas about the body had been twisted over centuries. They taught that women were inverted men, colder, wetter, weaker, and ruled by emotion. Their organs were thought to mirror men's, simply folded inward. This grotesque logic gave rise to 1,000 falsehoods. Doctors claimed that virgin women were tighter, warmer, even sweeter smelling. They believed the womb itself could shift inside the body, like a restless animal searching for release. These fantasies justified invasive examinations that violated women under the guise of medical truth. The Church, rather than challenging such ideas, absorbed them. Priests wrote that God had built a natural seal within women to mark chastity. They preached that the pain of a first encounter was a divine reminder of Eve's sin, a punishment inherited by all her daughters. In confessionals and sermons, women were taught that their purity was sacred, their desire dangerous, and their bodies suspect. When medicine failed to find evidence, theology filled the gap. A clean sheet was not an accident. It was a moral failure. The records that survive are cold and methodical. Inquisition archives, court testimonies, royal correspondence, each contains fragments of stories that are hard to read even now. In one 14th century case in Aragon, a young woman was examined by 3 midwives after her husband claimed she was unopened. The midwives declared her virginity intact, yet the husband refused to accept it. He accused her of witchcraft, arguing that sorcery had healed her body after sin. The court ordered a second inspection, this time in the presence of a priest. The verdict was unchanged: she was pure. But her reputation never recovered. She lived the rest of her life in quiet disgrace. In another account from France, a bride accused of impurity was subjected to an examination so brutal it left her permanently injured. The examining physician, convinced that resistance meant guilt, used metal instruments to locate proof. When none was found, he declared her corrupted. The husband abandoned her, the church annulled the marriage, and she vanished from record. The only evidence of her existence was a note in the physician's ledger: subject unfit for marriage. These tests were not limited to noble women. In towns and villages, midwives acted as both guardians and enforcers of morality. They inspected young girls accused of promiscuity, servants suspected by employers, and brides questioned by their husbands. Their authority came from experience, but their loyalty was bound to custom. To doubt the myth was to risk their position, or worse, their own reputations. Some midwives tried to soften the process, declaring girls pure enough, or claiming to see signs that were not there. Others, hardened by years of scrutiny, became instruments of the same system that oppressed them. Behind the clinical cruelty, however, was a deeper fear, the fear of uncertainty. Men in power could not stand not knowing. They wanted proof, visible, physical, final. The virginity test gave them that illusion. It made control tangible. It turned a woman's body into a contract, her anatomy into a witness. And once that logic took hold, it spread far beyond Europe. In Ottoman courts, physicians were called to verify brides before royal weddings. In Renaissance Italy, public trials of chastity were staged to determine inheritance rights. Even in the 17th century, when medicine began to change, surgeons still claimed they could see truth in the flesh. Some women, cornered by this madness, fought back through deception. They learned the language of purity. The right phrases, the right gestures, the right faint blush. They whispered to each other about ways to trick the tests, the herbs that could tighten skin, the sponges soaked in animal blood, the tricks of posture and breath. Purity became a performance, not of virtue, but of survival. The body had to tell the story society demanded, no matter how false it was. And then there were the healers who began to question. Quietly, cautiously, a few physicians started to note that the body did not behave as doctrine claimed. The 16th century anatomist Realdo Colombo wrote that he could find no membrane of virginity in most cadavers. His discovery was ignored. Later, the physician Ambroise Paré dared to say publicly that virginity could not be proven, that the idea itself was absurd. For this, he was condemned by the Church as corrupting public morals. Truth was not what people wanted. Certainty, even false, was safer. The cruelty of these myths was that they made the natural seem guilty. Pain, pleasure, or silence could all be used as evidence of sin. A woman who cried was resisting purity. A woman who did not was enjoying vice. Every reaction became an accusation. It was a trap with no exit, and its echoes still linger. The tests may have changed form, but the idea that a woman's worth can be inspected, verified, and judged has proven harder to kill than any superstition. By the Enlightenment, the virginity tests were officially discredited, but unofficially they endured. Aristocrats continued to demand them. Doctors continued to perform them. Even today, in corners of the modern world, the same rituals survive under new names. Hymen checks, purity certificates, tests of honor. The instruments are cleaner, the rooms quieter, but the logic is the same. A body as evidence, a woman as verdict. The price of purity, it turned out, was pain, inflicted not by enemies, but by the very hands that claim to protect. And though centuries have passed, the shadow of those verdicts remains. Every culture that worships chastity inherits a piece of that medieval fear, the need to prove innocence, the refusal to trust it. In those candlelit rooms where priests prayed and surgeons searched for signs that never existed, something larger was revealed, that the real myth was not about virginity at all, but about control, about who gets to decide what truth looks like, and whose body must bear the cost of it. It was called jus primae noctis, the rite of the first night. The story went like this. When a peasant married, his lord had the right to sleep with the bride before her husband could. In some tellings, the bride was sent to the manor house on her wedding night, trembling in silence while the lord exercised his privilege. In others, it was the husband himself who brought her, bowing, ashamed, powerless. Historians still argue whether this custom ever truly existed as law. But in the world that birthed it, it didn't need to. The legend was enough. The fear it described was real, because the Middle Ages were a world where rights did not flow upward. A lord's word was the law. He could take land, livestock, or labor with little recourse. Women, especially those born to peasant families, were counted among such possessions. Their bodies were tools for alliances, for heirs, for debts. And in that hierarchy, the rite of the first night became a story that captured a deeper truth, that no woman, no matter her vows or virtue, was safe from power. The origins of the myth trace back to medieval France and Scotland, though whispers of similar customs appeared elsewhere. The Latin term droit du seigneur, the Lord's right, began to surface in literature, legal charters, and church condemnations. Most of these references described it not as a law, but as a custom, one that rulers claimed to be abolishing. In the 15th century, a French charter from Normandy formally outlawed the shameful practice by which lords demand coin or company of their serfs' brides. That phrasing, coin or company, suggests the real nature of the custom, not enforced rape, but forced payment. A bride owed her lord a fee to protect her from him, protection from a sin that might not exist, but could. Fear was the currency that kept the fiction alive. Peasant couples knew that defiance could ruin them. A harvest might fail, a tax might double. The lord's men might inspect the village women during feast days. No one called it what it was: exploitation hidden behind ritual. The church looked away, preaching chastity while blessing the marriages that made it impossible. And the myth of the first night grew, whispered in taverns and confessions, shaped by outrage and memory until it became something more powerful than law, a story everyone half believed. There are fragments of testimony that suggest it happened, not as an institution, but as an abuse. Chronicles mention lords who took advantage of their tenants' daughters, claiming it as an ancient right. In 1247, a complaint from Catalonia accused a baron of demanding a night with every new bride in his fiefdom. The church condemned him not because of the act itself, but because he refused to pay penance. Another record from England centuries later describes a local lord who required grooms to bring their brides to his hall for inspection before marriage. Whether those inspections turned into assaults was never written down. Silence was safer than truth. The myth was also convenient, the weapon in the hands of reformers and critics. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu used jus primae noctis as a symbol of feudal corruption, proof of how barbaric the old order had been. Playwrights turned it into drama, novelists turned it into tragedy. In The Marriage of Figaro, the Count's lust for his servant's fiancée revived the old rumor for comic rebellion. The story became history by repetition. Fiction became memory. But even if the law itself was myth, its spirit was not. Feudal society was built on consent that was never asked for. A nobleman could decide a peasant's fate with a gesture. In that world, sexual violence was not an exception. It was a privilege disguised as custom. Women had little recourse. A wife's body was her husband's property, and his loyalty belonged to his lord. If the lord decided to take what he wanted, who would challenge him? To refuse might invite ruin, imprisonment, or worse, punishment for rebellion disguised as justice. The church played a double game. Publicly, it condemned droit du seigneur as sin. Privately, it tolerated similar behavior cloaked in clerical immunity. Parish priests fathered children with parishioners, bishops kept mistresses, monks visited brothels on feast days. Yet the same institution demanded that peasants pay marriage taxes, fees to approve unions or redeem brides from their lord's supposed claims. It was all part of the same machinery: sin and salvation, bought and sold. In time, the myth outlived its world. As serfdom waned, as lords lost their absolute power, the tale of the first night became a shorthand for everything that was wrong with feudalism, a fable of arrogance and submission. But traces of the belief persisted well into the Renaissance. In some remote regions, bride taxes were still collected by landlords or clerics. Sometimes the payment was symbolic: a chicken, a loaf of bread, a silver coin. Other times it was more sinister. A nobleman might demand that a bride spend the eve of her wedding at his manor for blessing. The ritual blessing, predictably, was never described in detail. The true horror of jus primae noctis was not whether it existed, but how easily it could have, how perfectly it fit the logic of the time. Power needed no parchment to justify itself. A law unspoken could be more dangerous than one written down, and in every kingdom there were women who lived under that unspoken threat, whose silence became the proof of the story's truth. There are glimpses of defiance, too. Folk tales from Scotland tell of brides who hid in barns or disguised themselves as servants to escape their lord's claim. In one version, a peasant groom switches places with his wife and is discovered only at the last moment, the deception saving her from harm. In another, the bride's family gathers at the manor gate, armed with pitchforks and torches, forcing the lord to bless the couple publicly instead. The peasants called it the burning of shame, a rebellion in miniature. Over centuries, the myth changed shape but never died. In colonial territories, similar stories appeared, conquerors claiming local women by right of conquest. In plantations and estates, overseers echoing the same entitlement. The details shifted, but the pattern remained. Power convincing itself it has permission. Jus primae noctis became a ghost story, retold wherever hierarchy met helplessness. Today, historians still debate its authenticity. Most agree it was never codified law, more rumor than record. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Whether or not it was written down, its truth lived in fear, in the knowledge that a wedding night could belong to someone else. For every century that passed, that fear changed faces, a nobleman, a priest, a master, a ruler. And every woman who endured it added another layer to the legend until fiction and reality became indistinguishable. In the end, jus primae noctis stands as both lie and metaphor. A lie because it may never have existed in statute. A metaphor because it never had to. It represented a deeper violence, the casual assumption that a woman's body was public property, to be claimed, taxed, or touched as power desired. The myth gave that violence a name. The world that created it gave it a place to live. And so the Lord's right became less a story about one night and more about a condition, a reminder that under feudalism, even love required permission. The law may have been imagined, but the terror was real. For every bride who prayed to be spared, for every husband who bowed his head in silence, jus primae noctis was more than legend. It was the truth hiding inside the lie. A warning that in a world built on power, the boundary between myth and reality is often just a locked door and a woman waiting behind it. Love, in many ancient cultures, was never simply an emotion. It was a transaction, a contract, a battlefield, and sometimes a ritual soaked in blood. Across centuries and continents, the act of marriage became entangled with ideas of purity, sacrifice, and control. Every civilization found its own way to bind two people together, and almost all of them mixed tenderness with terror. From the roaring fires of the Norse fjords to the silent tombs of imperial China, the union of bodies often came with the shadow of violence. Not always out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that without blood, the gods would not recognize the bond. In the frozen north, among the Vikings, weddings were less about vows and more about victory. The union of two families was imagined as a kind of truce, and before peace could be sealed, there had to be symbolic war. The bride's relatives staged mock battles against the groom's kin, shouting insults and brandishing axes dulled for ceremony. It was part theatre, part threat. The blood spilled, even from scratches, was considered sacred. It merged the fates of both clans, proving that the marriage was strong enough to withstand conflict. And yet beneath the noise there were darker rituals that few spoke of aloud. Some Norse sagas describe a rite known as Blottbruder, the blood bride. Before her wedding, a woman might be symbolically offered to the gods. A small cut was made on her arm, and the blood mixed with ale, which her groom would drink before taking her hand. It was meant to ensure fertility and divine favor, but it also served as a reminder that her body now belonged to more than herself. Among certain chieftain families, animal sacrifice replaced the symbolic cut. A goat or horse slain beside the bridal bed, its blood sprinkled on the posts for protection. To be married was to be marked, not just by name, but by offering. Further east, among the Scythians and early steppe tribes, the union of man and woman was sealed through pain shared equally. The couple stood before a blade or arrowhead and made shallow cuts on their hands. The blood dripped into a shared cup of wine or milk, which they drank together. The wound had to heal cleanly, a sign that their marriage would last. If it festered, elders said the union was cursed. Blood in these societies was more than symbol. It was currency with the divine. Without it, no promise was real. In ancient China, the rituals were quieter but no less haunting. Weddings were governed by precision, red silk, burning incense, and ancestral tablets that watched from lacquered altars. Yet even in this world of harmony and balance, fear lingered. The most disturbing form was the Minghun, or ghost marriage, the union of the living with the dead. When an unmarried man died, his spirit was thought restless, doomed to wander the afterlife alone. To bring him peace, his family would find a bride, sometimes deceased, sometimes alive, and marry her to his ghost. The ceremony mirrored that of the living, a red veil placed over the bride's head, offerings of wine and food, and a procession guided by lanterns instead of drums. If both partners were dead, their effigies were placed side by side in small coffins, joined by red thread. But if the bride was alive, she became a spirit wife, expected to live in mourning, serving the dead husband's family as though he still breathed. Her life was absorbed by absence, a widow to a man she had never met. These unions were not rare. Records from the Qing dynasty show that entire villages took part in arranging ghost marriages to restore family honor, believing that even in death, social balance must be maintained. In India, the echoes of fear took on a sacred form. For centuries, the sati ritual bound love and purity in the cruelest way imaginable. A widow, believing her devotion eternal, was expected to climb onto her husband's funeral pyre and burn beside him. Whether by faith, coercion, or despair, many did. The fire consumed not just a life, but an idea that womanhood found its perfection in death, not in survival. Even when the British outlawed the practice in the 19th century, it persisted in secret, fueled by whispers that a woman who refused was unfaithful, impure, unworthy of her husband's memory. Across the Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome, superstition turned weddings into battlefields against unseen forces. It was believed that envy and evil spirits targeted brides on their wedding day. To protect them, rituals mixed tenderness with dread. The bride was dressed in flame-colored veils to blind jealous spirits. She carried iron nails or sharp charms to ward off demons. In some regions, brides even wept publicly, not from sorrow, but as a performance to fool the gods into thinking she was unwilling. A joyful bride invited danger, a tearful one survived the night. In Africa, particularly among ancient tribes along the Nile and the Horn, blood rituals carried the weight of ancestral continuity. Marriage was not just between two individuals, but between two bloodlines. It required proof of loyalty to the clan spirits. Couples sometimes cut small marks into their bodies, merging their blood before the elders. The scars were permanent, visible reminders of the vows beneath them. But there were also harsher practices, purity tests conducted before marriage, rites of circumcision or seclusion, all justified by tradition, all rooted in the same anxious question. How do you bind faith, love, and fear together without losing control? In the highlands of medieval Japan, a different kind of violence shadowed love. The mukotsu, or silent marriage, was held at night, without witnesses. A samurai and his bride would exchange cups of sake before a small shrine. But if she was from a rival family, her loyalty was proven through ordeal. Walking barefoot across cold water or holding a burning ember without crying out. Pain became proof. Silence, virtue. In that stillness, love and obedience became indistinguishable. What ties all these rituals together, and the Viking sacrifices, the Scythian blood cups, the ghost marriages, the widow's pyre, is not cruelty for its own sake, but fear disguised as devotion. Every culture, in its own way, feared what could not be seen: death, infertility, betrayal, divine wrath. Blood, pain, and purity became the currencies used to bargain with those fears. To bind two people, they believed, something had to be given, something physical, visible, irreversible. And yet beneath all the horror there's a strange tenderness. The lovers who bled together believed they were ensuring survival. The widow who faced the fire believed she was protecting her husband's spirit. The families who arranged ghost marriages believed they were healing cosmic loneliness. None of them saw cruelty, only necessity. Only love, twisted by superstition until it became unrecognizable. By the time the modern era dawned, many of these rites had faded or changed shape. The blood was replaced by ink and signatures, the sacrifices by rings and vows. But the impulse remained. The same fears that demanded blood still whisper beneath the ceremonies today. The fear of being forgotten, of losing control, of love dissolving into nothing. In every age, humanity has tried to anchor love to something solid. For the ancients, that anchor was blood. It was proof, promise, and prison all at once. A reminder that every bond, no matter how sacred, once came with a shadow. And in the glow of torches or candlelight, those shadows danced beside every bride and groom, silent witnesses to the old, trembling truth. That love, when mixed with fear, can make monsters out of rituals meant to bless. Death did not end marriage. In many corners of the ancient and medieval world, it simply delayed it. Across centuries, families have tried to heal grief with ritual, to stitch together the living and the dead through ceremony. It sounds grotesque now, a bride marrying a corpse, a groom pledging himself to a ghost. But to those who practiced it, these were not horrors. They were acts of devotion, duty, and fear. Fear of restless spirits, fear of dishonor, fear that love left unfinished might return as something vengeful. The living and the dead, bound not by touch but by memory, made vows in whispers that gods alone could hear. One of the most haunting of these customs began in ancient China, where the line between life and afterlife was never sharply drawn. The Chinese believed that an unmarried person could not find peace in death. Without a spouse, their soul would wander the spirit world as a hungry ghost, lonely, cold, and unanchored. To save them, families arranged what came to be called Minghun, or ghost marriages. These were not symbolic. They followed the same steps as ordinary weddings, down to the red bridal veil, the ancestral offerings, and the formal procession. The difference was that one, sometimes both, of the participants was already dead. If a young man died before marrying, his family would search for a suitable bride. Sometimes another deceased person, sometimes a living woman. If the bride was alive, she became a spirit wife. She would live with the man's family, wear mourning clothes, and serve his spirit as though he still walked among them. She could not remarry, and any children she bore later would be legally counted as belonging to her dead husband's line. It was not love, but restitution, a way to repair what death had broken. For the families involved, it meant that lineage continued, that the ancestors would be appeased, that shame would not linger. The ritual could be elaborate. A coffin for the deceased groom was carried beside an empty sedan chair for the bride. Paper effigies, servants, musicians, even livestock were burned to accompany them into the spirit realm. The living guests ate and drank as if attending any wedding, while priests chanted prayers to unite the two souls beyond the veil. When both parties were deceased, their bones or burial tablets were placed side by side, bound with red silk. The belief was that the spirits, once joined, would protect their descendants. A loveless, lifeless marriage became a kind of spell against misfortune. But not every ghost marriage was peaceful. In some accounts, the spirits themselves demanded them. Villagers told stories of dead bachelors appearing in dreams, pleading for a bride. Ominous events, sudden illness, livestock dying, strange noises in the night, were taken as signs of their unrest. To refuse was to risk haunting. In desperation, families arranged posthumous unions to quiet the dead. Even as late as the 20th century, secret Minghun ceremonies continued in parts of rural China, performed at night with effigies instead of bodies. The ghost bride and ghost groom, folded from paper, burned to ash, joined in a marriage no living eyes would ever see. The idea of marrying the dead was not confined to Asia. In 19th century France, a practice known as mariage posthume emerged, though under very different motives. During the chaos of World War I, many women lost fiancés to the trenches before they could wed. The grief was unbearable, but the bureaucracy was crueler. Without marriage, they had no claim to pensions, property, or legitimacy for their unborn children. And so the French government allowed something unprecedented. The living could marry the dead. A judge could authorize a union if proof existed that the deceased intended to marry before death. The ceremonies were somber. A photograph of the dead groom stood where he would have stood, his name read aloud by the officiant. The bride answered, "We alone." Rings were exchanged, hers to wear, his placed on a framed portrait or empty chair. There was no kiss, no celebration, just the signing of papers that joined the living and the departed. For some, it was an act of closure. For others, a ghostly echo of what should have been. One bride, interviewed in 1920, said quietly, "I wanted to be his wife, even if only in the eyes of God." Other versions of this ritual appeared in stranger, older forms. In tribal regions of Africa, death sometimes interrupted an engagement, but obligation remained. The family of the deceased groom might offer his younger brother as a stand-in, performing the wedding on the dead man's behalf. The children born of this union were said to belong to the spirit of the first son, a continuation of his name through another man's life. Among the Nuer of Sudan, such marriages were common. They called it ghost husbandhood. The dead, they believed, had a right to descendants. To deny them, that was to anger the ancestors. In Northern Europe, echoes of similar ideas survived in folklore. Old Norse sagas tell of women pledged to warriors who fell in battle. Unable to break their vows, they performed death weddings, solitary ceremonies by grave sites where they placed their wedding garlands on the earth and declared themselves wed to the slain. In return, the dead man's family would treat her as a widow, entitled to his share of inheritance and honor. The ritual blurred mourning with matrimony, love with loss. Even in Christianized Scandinavia, the belief persisted that love sworn before death had to be fulfilled after. Each of these customs, from ghost marriages to posthumous vows, shared the same haunting logic, that death did not end duty. Marriage, in their eyes, was more than contract or companionship. It was continuity, a bridge between worlds. If life was a fragile thread, then marriage tied it to something eternal. The living feared that untied spirits would return, jealous, hungry, vengeful, so they bound them with ceremony. Even grief became ritualized, wrapped in silk and incense, because it was easier to sanctify sorrow than to face its silence. Of course, there was exploitation too. In some ghost marriages, the living bride had little say. Families desperate for wealth or favor arranged matches between the dead of different clans, sealing political ties beyond the grave. Dowries still changed hands. Funerals became opportunities for bargaining. In the shadows of filial piety, there were merchants who profited from death, selling spirit brides, corpses or effigies meant to accompany the dead. Police records from the early 20th century show cases of grave robbing, where women's bodies were stolen to be sold for ghost marriages. The line between faith and crime blurred, and devotion became industry. Yet beneath that darkness lay something universal: the refusal to let go. To marry the dead was to insist that love, or duty, or lineage could not be broken by mortality. It was grief made ceremonial. The vows may have been whispered to ashes, but they carried a defiance stronger than reason. That absence could still be honored, that silence could still answer. In the end, these death-bound unions reveal a truth that the living have always feared: that love demands completion, even when one heart has stopped beating. Across the centuries, people have found ways to speak to the departed, to finish the stories death interrupts. Whether in a village burning paper, effigies beneath the moon, or a widow standing before an empty chair, the act is the same. To marry the dead is to confess that love, once promised, does not know how to stop. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between grief and ritual, that confession becomes its own kind of peace. It didn't happen all at once, this slow unraveling of spectacle into silence. For thousands of years, marriage had been public property, watched, blessed, inspected, and judged. The couple stood at the center of a ritual designed not for love, but for lineage, alliances, and law. But over the centuries, the noise began to fade. The crowds thinned. The bed curtains finally closed. What had once belonged to the village, the court, or the church began to retreat into the private spaces of two people alone. Marriage changed shape, not because humanity suddenly grew tender, but because power itself began to shift. In the medieval world, love had been dangerous, even subversive. It disrupted the order of things. Nobles married for treaties, merchants for trade, peasants for survival. To marry for affection was to risk scandal. But by the late Middle Ages, something new began to stir, the quiet rebellion of feeling. Troubadours sang of secret loves that defied rank and religion. Their verses reached the ears of the noble courts, where queens and duchesses began to imagine affection as something worthy of poetry, not sin. Slowly, marriage began to absorb the language of choice. The Reformation cracked open the institution. When Martin Luther denounced the Catholic Church's monopoly over marriage, he argued that it was a social contract, not a sacrament, something for individuals, not priests, to define. The wedding no longer needed to happen inside a church, and its meaning no longer required divine permission. This shift did not immediately free women or elevate love, but it planted a seed that a vow could exist between equals, whispered rather than witnessed. By the Enlightenment, that whisper had grown louder. Philosophers began to question whether consent, not coercion, not family duty, should be the foundation of marriage. The idea was radical, that two people might marry not for survival, but for happiness. Rousseau and Locke wrote about partnership as something chosen by reason and feeling alike. It was the birth of what we now call companionate marriage, the belief that emotional connection mattered more than property or bloodline. The courts followed slowly. In England until the 18th century, a woman's legal identity still disappeared upon marriage. She became, in law, an extension of her husband. But as revolutions swept through Europe, the language of rights began to infiltrate even the most intimate spaces. The industrial age accelerated it further. The crowded cities, the rise of literacy, the spread of private homes, all these transformed the ceremony itself. Where weddings had once been loud public performances, they became domestic affairs. The noise of the feast gave way to the quiet of parlours and drawing rooms. Privacy became the new luxury. The Victorians perfected the illusion. Their weddings were grand, yes, white dresses, lace veils and church bells, but they were also deeply internal. The bride's attire symbolized purity, yet her gaze, downcast and private, hinted at something more personal: introspection, individuality. Even as society wrapped love in ritual, it was beginning to recognize that the ceremony belonged to the couple, not to the crowd. The legal documents still bore witnesses, but the emotional truth had moved inward. By the 20th century, the transformation was complete. Marriage was no longer just a contract between families or nations. It was a story, one told by two people who believed they were choosing their own ending. Films and novels turned weddings into scenes of destiny rather than duty. The kiss, once forbidden in ceremony, became the moment audiences waited for. And yet, beneath the music and the flowers, old echoes remained. The dowry had become a gift registry. The blood tests of purity were replaced by medical certificates. The priest's approval lingered in the bureaucratic signature of the state. Control had changed its face, not its intent. In the modern era, the illusion of privacy became both a freedom and a prison. Couples believed they had escaped the eyes of the world, but the weight of expectation followed them in subtler forms. The ideal of the perfect marriage, romantic, eternal, fulfilling, was its own kind of script. Where the medieval bride feared public shame, the modern one fears personal failure. Divorce, once a sin, became a statistic, and yet its stigma survived. Society still watched, only now, through quieter means, whispers, comparisons, the unspoken rules of love. Even the ceremonies themselves carry ghosts. The white dress, a symbol of innocence invented in the 19th century, echoes the same obsession with purity that haunted medieval beds. The father walking the bride down the aisle recalls an ancient transaction, the transfer of ownership from one man to another. The ring, that unbroken circle, was once a sign of binding rather than belonging. What we call tradition is often just a softened memory of control, and yet something beautiful persists. In every age, amid all the ritual and restraint, there has been a moment when the crowd fades and the two people at the center meet each other's eyes. That moment, unplanned and ungoverned, has always been the quiet rebellion at the heart of marriage. It is the moment when duty bends into tenderness, when the contract becomes a promise. In the flicker of that gaze, whether under candlelight or camera flash, lies the fragile miracle that centuries of law and superstition have never fully extinguished. What we have now is not freedom without history, but freedom built on its ruins. The path from the bedding chamber to the modern ceremony is not a clean one. It is littered with ghosts, of child brides, of unconsented unions, of purity and possession. But each century has chipped away at the noise, peeling back the layers until what remains is simple. Two people saying yes. Yes, not to power, not to family, not to gods or governments, but to each other. And perhaps that is the quiet truth marriage has been circling all along. For millennia, humanity built cages around love to make it last, then spent just as long trying to break them open. The vows remain, the rituals endure, but somewhere between "I do" and "till death do us part," the meaning shifted. It no longer belongs to the crowd, it belongs to the whisper. So when the music fades and the doors close, when the guests are gone and the lights go dim, what's left is what marriage was always meant to be. Not a performance, but a promise. Not a public duty, but a private peace. And in that silence, after centuries of spectacle and fear, the vow finally sounds like what it was supposed to be from the start. An echo between two hearts, unguarded and human. Tonight, the echoes of the past grow quiet. The laughter of drunken guests, the whisper of prayers, the rustle of silk, all fade into stillness. What began as a public performance has become a private promise, softer than the turning of a page. The world outside is distant now. The torches have burned out. The halls are empty. And somewhere, beneath the hush of centuries, two hands still find each other in the dark. Rest now. The story of marriage, with all its chaos and beauty, has always ended the same way, in the simple peace of being home.